Scopes trial of 1925 here in Dayton, Tennessee, has become the most famous trial in America. A legend has grown up that describes it as part of the ongoing conflict between science and faith. But what many of us today know about the Scopes trial comes from a film called Inherit the Wind, made in the 1960s.
They were concerned about a problem in America in the 50s called McCarthyism. And that was an attack on communist influences. We're in the middle of the Cold War, and as in the early 50s, there had been concern that there was growing communist influence had percolated through American business elite, Hollywood, some in the State Department and government, and there were public testimonies. They had congressional hearings where they'd bring in suspected communists or the friends of suspected communists and blacklist them, expose them, blacklist them from work, blacklist them from appearing in Hollywood movies or whatever if they were actors. And there was a reaction against that by the mid-50s. And Jerry Lawrence and Bob Lee, who were playwrights, cast around to try to expose, to show what was happening, but it was still too close to the event. You couldn't attack McCarthyism head on. So their idea was to take a past event in American history and show it, make a play about it, an adversarial trial or something like this. Take this past event, but really twist it and change it so that what you're doing is you're exposing the folly of mob mentality going after innocent people. Which is what they perceived as the problem of McCarthyism. Certainly there were probably a few communists, but it was like a witch hunt. Now, they weren't the only ones that did it, and probably as equally famous a play in American history, maybe even more famous, was The Crucible, where the playwright, the person who wrote The Crucible, Arthur Miller, had gone back at the same time and gone back to the Salem witchcraft trials, which were a known event, and then made a play about them, but changed them, tweaked them, made it look like it was clear that the presiding judge, the overriding judge, was like McCarthy. McCarthy was the senator who held the hearings to expose communists. And that's what Jerry Lawrence and Bob Lee were doing. They made no bones about it. They told me when I was interviewing them, but it had long since. They'd given a lot of interviews before. And so what they did is they twisted the actual trial to make the character of William Jennings Bryan appear much like McCarthy. He was a self-serving demagogue. And the town had a mob mentality, that they were easily twisted by the speaking of a fundamentalist minister who lived in town, a fellow they named Jeremiah Brown, which evokes images of the prophet Jeremiah, and in America of John Brown, the crusading abolitionist. There was no Jeremiah Brown in Dayton. There was no local fundamentalist minister in Dayton. It wasn't that sort of a town. There's no state law involved in Inherit the Wind. Inherit the Wind is this town gets riled up by this minister who stirs the pot, and then they go out and they grab Scopes, who in the play and in the movie is teaching evolution, and they throw him in jail, and they burn him in effigy, and they march and they jeer, and the poor children in this classroom are confused and don't know what to think, and then they call in this William Jennings Bryan figure, this former president, who comes and joins this crusading mob and then persecutes him in trial, much like McCarthy did, in the sense that he calls in friends and in fact his fiancée, and grills them on the stand to say that Scopes was an atheist, that Scopes was an agnostic, that Scopes didn't believe in God. Well, none of that happened in Dayton. That wasn't an issue of whether Scopes believed in God. Scopes didn't have a fiancée. There wasn't nobody was attacking John Scopes. They were attacking a law that didn't pass by the state of Tennessee. So that was the story of McCarthyism, that here was this senator who rallied up the American public to go after communists everywhere, to find a communist under every rock. And so here that was to find an atheist every other rock and expose him. So that became the sense that Scopes was the center of this trial. And Scopes was this crusading young scholar who stood up for teaching evolution and taught evolution in this small town, and the mob destroys him. Well, that's nothing to do with the real story. The real story is the state of Tennessee passes a law, and they have a test case about it. But this becomes, because Inherit the Wind becomes a very popular play, and then is turned into a movie and is a movie with Spencer Tracy, and is really a beautiful, if you're talking about caring about tolerance and individual freedom, I mean, Inherit the Wind is an inspiring story. It's just not the story of the Scopes trial.
Inherit the Wind wasn't really about the Scopes trial at all. It was a picture of the anti-communist witch hunts that were going on in America in the 1950s. It represented the Scopes trial in an inaccurate, fictional form. And yet this is the myth that many of us today believe. Isn't it time to get at the facts behind the myth? Next time, in the last programme in this series, we'll look back at what we've discovered about the conflict between science and faith.